The sun was slowly setting over the wide and quiet land of the Wild West. The sky was a soft orange, and the wind moved gently through the tall grass. A few birds flew low over the fields, and in the distance, the shape of a small town stood against the evening light. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and where news, true or false, traveled fast. Nayeli walked barefoot along the dusty road. She was a young Apache girl no older than 16. Her long black hair was tied with a simple ribbon, and her dark eyes watched everything around her carefully. She carried a small bundle of woven baskets on her back. Each one was made with her own hands. It was her way of earning a few coins or trading for food. Most of the townsfolk had seen her many times before, walking the same road, selling her baskets with a shy smile. She didn't say much to strangers. She had learned that silence was safer, but when she did speak, her voice was soft with a gentle accent. Many in town did not take the time to understand her. They saw her as different. Some were kind to her. Others simply looked away, and a few, sadly, held on to old fears and stories that made their hearts hard. As Nayeli neared the town, she noticed something different that day. There was a strange silence in the air. Usually the blacksmith's hammer could be heard from far away, or the laughter from the saloon would echo down the street. But this evening, only the sound of the wind filled the air. A few men stood outside the general store talking in low, serious voices. Their faces were tense. Nayeli slowed her steps. She could feel something was wrong, even if she didn't yet know what it was. Her people had always been taught to listen to the silence, to read the air. Trouble had a way of whispering before it arrived. She turned toward the small ranch at the edge of town. It belonged to Caleb Wright, a tall man with kind blue eyes and hands that had worked the land for many years. Caleb was one of the few who had always treated Nayeli with respect. When she was younger, his wife had once given her warm bread on a cold morning. Nayeli had never forgotten that kindness. As she approached the ranch, she saw Caleb at the fence talking to two other men. Their voices were low but sharp. Caleb's brow was furrowed, and the other men were shaking their heads. Nayeli hesitated, unsure whether to go closer or turn back. But Caleb saw her and raised his hand slightly, a small gesture of greeting. "Nayeli," he called out gently, "you're out late today." She walked closer, her bare feet barely making a sound on the dirt road. "I bring baskets," she said softly, showing the bundle on her back. Caleb gave her a warm but distracted smile. "You always do good work," he said. But his eyes still looked worried. She could feel it, like a storm that hadn't yet reached the fields. One of the other men looked at Nayeli in a way she didn't like. Not angry, but sharp, like a man already holding a thought in his head, one that could grow into something dangerous. She lowered her gaze and quietly stepped back. "Did you hear anything out on the road today?" Caleb asked her suddenly. Nayeli shook her head. "Only wind," she said softly. "Nothing more," Caleb nodded slowly. He didn't press her, but the two other men whispered to each other, too quiet for her to understand. She felt a chill, though the evening air was still warm. As the night fell, Nayeli made her way back toward the small camp on the edge of the valley where her people stayed. The stars began to light up the sky one by one. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and walked quickly. She didn't like how the men had looked at her. She didn't like the silence of the town. The next morning the sun rose bright and clear, but the town was not the same. A loud voice called out near the center of the street. A group of men had gathered outside the sheriff's small office. People came running from every corner of town, talking in fast, worried tones. The blacksmith wiped his hands on his apron and stepped out of his shop. The storekeeper left his counter. Even the children stopped playing to see what was happening. Nayeli, curious but cautious, stood at a distance behind the fence. She saw Caleb among the crowd. His face was serious. A man she did not know was shouting about a ranch raid. Some cattle were missing. More than that, someone had been hurt. People were angry, not just worried. The kind of anger that spreads quickly like a spark in dry grass. She didn't understand every word they were saying, but she caught enough. Cattle, stolen, camp, Apache. The word Apache hung in the air like a weight. She felt her chest tighten. Her people had nothing to do with it. They lived quietly, away from trouble. But she also knew that in times of fear, people didn't always look for truth first. By midday, the talk had turned into suspicion. A man said he saw someone dark-haired near the ranch the day before. Another claimed he found a trail leading toward the hills. None of them had real proof, but the story grew with each retelling. And as it grew, it turned its eyes toward Nayeli. Someone whispered her name. Then another. Soon it wasn't just a whisper. It was a murmur moving through the crowd like wind through leaves. Caleb tried to speak, tried to calm them, but not everyone listened. A group of men started walking toward the road that led out of town. The same road Nayeli had walked yesterday. They didn't stop at the facts. They didn't want questions. They wanted someone to blame. Nayeli had gone to the river to wash the dust from her hands when she heard footsteps. She turned and saw 3 men walking toward her. Their faces were tight with something she didn't fully understand. Not anger she could see, but a cold, hard look, the kind that makes a person's stomach twist. "Girl," one of them said. His voice was sharp. "We need to talk." She stood still. "Why?" she asked softly. Her English wasn't perfect, but she could hear the weight behind their words. "Where were you yesterday?" the man asked. "Here," Nayeli replied honestly. "Basket work." The man crossed his arms. "Someone saw you near the ranch." She shook her head slowly. "I walk road. I sell baskets. I do nothing bad." But their minds had already begun to close like a door slowly shutting. One of the men looked back toward town. A few others were coming, more faces joining the group. She didn't understand why this was happening, but her heart began to beat fast. She felt like a bird watching the net come closer. "Come with us," the man said. His voice wasn't kind. It wasn't cruel either. It was cold. She followed quietly because she had learned long ago that when fear filled a place, words often fell like stones into water. They sank, unheard. As they reached the town, more people were waiting. Some whispered. Some pointed. A few simply watched in silence. She saw Caleb standing near the fence. When their eyes met, she saw a question in his. He didn't believe what they were saying. She could feel it. But there were too many voices, and they were growing louder. The sheriff, a tired man with a hat too big for his head, stepped out of his small office. He tried to keep order, but the crowd pushed forward with words and claims and no real proof. Someone said they saw tracks. Someone said they heard something in the night. Someone else simply repeated what they had already heard. In the end, it all sounded the same. Blame. Nayeli stood there holding her bundle of baskets. Her hands trembled, not from guilt, but from fear. She had done nothing wrong. But she could feel how quickly a story could turn against someone like her. She wasn't from their world. She didn't speak their language perfectly. She was an easy target. Caleb stepped forward finally. "She's just a girl," he said, his voice firm. "You've got no proof," but others spoke over him. Fear had made their voices louder. Words like guilty and must pay rose into the air. Nayeli looked around. She didn't see faces anymore, only walls closing in. She had never felt so alone. She wanted to speak, to explain, to shout the truth. But her throat was tight and her heart beat like a drum in her chest. Caleb clenched his fists at his sides. He had seen many storms in his life. Storms that broke trees, storms that flooded the land. But this was worse. This was a storm made of people's anger, and it moved fast. The sun began to set again, the sky turning a deep red. The same sky that had been calm the night before now felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. The crowd was restless, their whispers turning into sharp, short words. Nayeli stood there, her small figure almost swallowed by the larger group around her. She didn't know what would happen next. She only knew that everything had changed in just one day. Yesterday she was the girl who sold baskets. Today she was the girl they blamed. And in that moment, as the evening light fell across the town, Caleb Wright made a quiet promise to himself. He would not stand by and watch an innocent girl be crushed by a lie. But the road ahead would not be easy. The night was growing darker, and the story had only begun. The sky over the small town was quiet that night, but inside everything felt unsettled. The air was heavy like before a storm. People whispered in corners, sharing stories they weren't sure were true. Words had turned into rumors, and rumors had grown into something much bigger than facts. And at the center of it all stood a frightened Apache girl who had done nothing wrong. Nayeli sat on the wooden step near the sheriff's office, her small bundle of baskets beside her. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and though she kept her head down, her eyes saw everything. She saw the way people walked past quickly, the way they avoided looking at her. the way their whispers floated in the air like smoke. She felt like a bird caught in a net. She hadn't done anything, but she couldn't fly away. The sun had gone down hours ago, and the night had grown colder. The stars were bright, but the world around her felt dark. Inside, the sheriff sat at his desk. He didn't say much. He didn't know what to do. He had heard the stories, but none of them had real proof. He wasn't a bad man, but he was afraid of the town turning against him if he spoke up too loudly. And fear, like a shadow, can make even good people stand still. Caleb Wright, the rancher with kind blue eyes, hadn't left town since the afternoon. He had watched the whispers turn into angry voices. He had seen how quickly people could choose a target just to feel safer. And he had seen Nayeli's eyes, wide, quiet, and full of fear. He knew she didn't deserve what was happening. Caleb stood near the edge of the crowd, his hat pulled low over his brow. He wasn't a man who liked to shout, but he wasn't a man who walked away either. He remembered the day years ago when his wife had handed Nayeli a piece of warm bread. He remembered the shy smile she gave in return. She was just a child then, and in many ways she was still just a girl. As the crowd gathered again the next morning, the sun rose pale and cold. People wanted someone to blame for the stolen cattle and the trouble they believed had happened. No one had seen anything clearly, but that didn't seem to matter anymore. She was near the ranch, someone said. She was walking the road that day, another added. She must have known something. A third voice insisted. Caleb stepped forward. You don't know what you're saying, he told them. She walks this road every week. That doesn't make her guilty. But his calm voice was nearly lost in the sea of louder ones. People were scared, and scared people sometimes hold on to the wrong things. Nayeli sat quietly, watching faces blur into one another. She didn't understand every word, but she understood the feeling in the air. It was sharp, cold, and growing stronger. She wanted to speak, but her voice felt trapped somewhere deep inside her chest. Caleb turned to the sheriff. You can't let this go on, he said. She's just a girl, the sheriff sighed. I don't want trouble, Caleb. People are upset. If we don't calm them down, this town will break into pieces. Caleb's jaw tightened. Then let's show them the truth. That afternoon, while the crowd grew restless, Caleb saddled his horse. His plan was simple. Go to the place where the cattle had been taken, follow the tracks, and find what really happened. If he could bring back proof, he could stop this before it turned worse. The wind picked up as he rode out. Dust swirled around his boots. The land stretched wide. Open fields, dry brush, and a few scattered cottonwood trees. Caleb knew these lands like the lines on his own hands. He followed the faint prints in the dirt, not rushing, not stopping. His eyes were trained to notice things most people missed. Back in town, Nayeli sat on a bench in front of the sheriff's office. A few children passed by, curious but unsure whether to speak. One little girl gave her a small flower before running away. Nayeli held it gently in her hand. It was the first kind gesture she had felt since everything began. Hours passed and the sun began to sink again. The crowd grew uneasy. Some people still muttered about her. Others had started to wonder if they might have been wrong. Caleb had always been trusted in that town. If anyone could find the truth, it was him. Far beyond the town, Caleb followed the trail into a shallow valley. That's where he saw what he had expected. The tracks didn't lead toward Nayeli's people's camp at all. They curved away, heading toward a canyon where a group of cattle thieves had hidden before. The ground told its story if someone cared to listen. Caleb cared. He leaned down from his horse and studied the marks carefully. They were deeper than a single rider would make. More than one horse, more than one person. And they were not Apache tracks. He knew the difference. He had ridden these lands for years. As the wind grew colder, Caleb turned his horse around. He had seen enough to know the truth. The blame thrown at Nayeli was built on nothing more than fear and a handful of careless words. When he returned, the first stars were already shining. The town was gathered again. The air was thick with tension, but when Caleb rode down the road, something changed. People stepped back to let him through. He dismounted slowly, dust covering his boots, and faced them. I found the tracks, Caleb said clearly, and they don't lead anywhere near her camp. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. Another muttered something too quiet to hear. Caleb kept going. The trail heads toward the canyon. That's where cattle thieves have hidden before. We all know it. So stop blaming someone who had nothing to do with it. The sheriff stepped forward, unsure what to say. "You're sure?" Caleb nodded. "I've ridden these lands since before most of you built your fences. I know what I saw." All eyes slowly turned to Nayeli. She was still sitting quietly, the little flower still in her hand. Her face showed no anger and just quiet hope. The loudest voices in the crowd began to quiet down. One man who had shouted the loudest earlier now looked at the ground, as if the dust itself was more interesting than the truth standing in front of him. Another woman who had repeated rumors felt her cheeks burn with guilt. Caleb stepped closer to Nayeli and gently placed a hand on her shoulder, a quiet but clear sign of support. "She doesn't owe anyone here an apology," he said, "but a few of you might owe her one." The crowd didn't have an answer. The wind moved through the street softly, like a reminder of how small their loudness suddenly felt. The sheriff cleared his throat. "I'll send a search party out to the canyon," he said. "We'll find the real ones responsible." But Caleb wasn't done. His voice grew firmer. "And next time, before you all listen to whispers, think about who gets hurt by them. Think about what it means to point at someone just because they're different. It wasn't a speech made with fancy words, but it didn't need to be. It was honest. It was enough." Nayeli's eyes filled with quiet tears. Not because of sadness, but because someone had finally spoken for her. She didn't have the right words in their language, but she looked at Caleb with a soft smile that said more than words ever could. In the days that followed, the town slowly returned to its rhythm. The thieves were found near the canyon, just as Caleb had said. The stolen cattle were returned, and one by one, the same people who had whispered against Nayeli began to speak differently. Some offered small words of apology. Some simply nodded to her when she passed, no longer looking away. Trust doesn't grow overnight, but it can begin with a single honest act. Caleb continued his work at the ranch. Nayeli continued weaving her baskets and walking the dusty road. But from that day on, something between them and the town had quietly changed. People remembered how close they came to letting fear make their choices, and how one man's courage stopped it. Every time Nayeli walked into town after that, she held her head a little higher. She still didn't speak much, but she didn't have to. The story of what had happened became something people told their children for years. The day a whisper nearly hurt an innocent girl, and the day a rancher's courage brought back the truth. Caleb often said nothing about it. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He just thought of it as the right thing to do. But others remembered. They remembered the quiet strength it took to stand between fear and truth. One evening, months later, Nayeli sat under the same cottonwood tree where everything had begun. The sunset painted the sky gold. The air was warm and calm again. She listened to the wind, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't carry whispers. It carried peace. She knew life would not always be easy, but she also knew now that not everyone turned away. Some stood beside you when it mattered most, and sometimes one honest voice can change the whole story. And so, the quiet Apache girl who once walked alone with her baskets became a quiet reminder to the town of what happens when truth stands taller than fear. The wind carried her story softly across the fields, not as a tale of blame, but as a memory of courage, kindness, and hope.